G'day guys, and today I want to share with you all the first part in a little series I want to make regarding the adverse side effects of porn. Now this is something I've been, as I mentioned previously in another video, something I've been thinking about a little bit more, because obviously I myself, having not watched porn for about 3 or 4 years at this point, I'm totally habituated off porn. I never think about it, but obviously with the coming of No Nut November recently, it got me thinking about it again and just seeing how much people seem to be struggling with this thing, reading in comments, people talking about how they're relapsing and this sort of thing. So what I wanted to do with this little series is share with you knowledge and information regarding the neurological effects of porn on your brain. So once you know how something works and how it affects you, it should become that much easier to muster the willpower to make a change to better yourself. And that's really what I want this channel to be about at the end of the day. Bettering yourself, improving your own life, and I will help you with this by providing you with some knowledge. So the first thing I want to touch on is sensitization. Now sensitization refers to hyperactivity or excitement within your brain, but only in response to specific cues your brain associates with your addiction, which in this case will be porn. Now something to always think about, and I continually remind myself and you all in my videos, is that we need to remind ourselves that as a biological unit, a human is very much still an animal. There have been millions of years of evolution that have led us up to the biological place we're in, and unfortunately it's very easy to forget this because of the cultural and technological changes that have come about of the modern world just in the recent 100 or 200 years. It is easy to forget that we were animals just very recently, biologically speaking, and there are these evolutionary drives that are in place. And obviously one of the strongest, if not the strongest evolutionary drives is sexual reproduction. Animals, and this goes way back millions of years, all the way to single-celled organisms. They really want to produce. Humans really want to reproduce. And so we need to remind ourselves about this because this can have such a powerful effect on our brain's neurochemistry. So essentially, stimulation of your brain alters the structure and chemistry of your brain's reward circuitry. And this is what this all really comes back to, your brain's reward circuitry. So your brain's reward circuitry has a marked ability to influence and or directly control your bodily functions, things such as moods, emotions, drives, urges, and as pertaining to sexual stimulation, your libido and erectile function. The reward center of your brain also directly controls your autonomic or unconscious or unthinking nervous system and most major hormone secretions which directly control your sexual arousal. So we can think of secretions such as testosterone, which makes you horny, and obviously your autonomic nervous system is in charge of smooth muscle, which you can't control, that gives you erections. So obviously if we start messing around with this by screwing around with brain stimulations, then we might, again, it's pretty easy to see how your libido can be affected because you don't get aroused by certain things and you can't get erections based on certain stimuli. So thinking very simply, you don't have to will yourself to get horny. It's not a difficult thing, it just happens without you thinking because it's an unconscious nervous reaction. Why it happens though depends on the pathways that you have formed within the neural networks of your reward circuitry. So when we're stimulated, we can't control our reaction to this because it's an unconscious nervous reaction, but we can control what stimuluses we consume. That's a conscious decision we make every day. So for example, if we choose to watch porn, then that's a stimulation that is going to alter the structure and chemistry of our brain, and that's the sort of thing that we're going to get stimulated by. That's the sort of thing that's going to arouse us. Now obviously, talking about neurochemistry, brain chemistry, reward circuitry and all this stuff, it is a pretty complicated topic, and I want to try to render it down as simply as possible. So when we're discussing sensitization, there are 3 things that I want to talk about, and these are long-term potentiation, long-term depression, and DeltaFosB, and we'll go through them one by one. So first up we have long-term potentiation, and long-term potentiation, or LTP, is the basis of memory formation. The reward center of your brain will signal that an experience that you've had was important by sending dopamine, which is the sort of the reward chemical, to your prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. The more dopamine, the more importance the experience is considered. So if the experience is something minor, oh look, I found that lost pair of socks, your brain isn't going to attach as much dopamine as one of the powerful evolutionary drives that drives almost all of biology, which would be sexual reproduction. A lot of dopamine will be attached to stimulation which is considered to be sexual reproduction. And something to keep in mind is, again, I don't believe that your brain can tell the difference between porn and the real thing. Your brain, when you wank to porn, does actually think you're engaging in sexual intercourse and reward you as such. So the prefrontal cortex will respond to this dopamine influx in two different ways. Firstly, it will link things associated with this award to the event. So your brain is an organ that's really good at noticing patterns. So if you have this really stimulating event, the brain obviously wants you to keep repeating that because it's beneficial for your survival in some capacity. And obviously, again, sexual reproduction, really important. Passing on your genes, very important in the evolutionary sense. So it's going to pay very close attention to events that led up to this very highly stimulating event. What happened, how can we notice these things, and how can we, again, reward the body, which will encourage us to partake in these behaviors that lead up to a very stimulating event. So obviously, if we're thinking in terms of addiction, in terms of alcoholism, the clinking of glass and other ambient noise of a bar can trigger a desire to drink, because these are things that lead up to the consumption of alcohol, which the brain considers to be a very highly rewarding, stimulating event. And again, if we're thinking about porn, the shutting of the front door and the realization that, I'm alone can trigger a desire to consume porn, because that's the things your brain has noticed lead up to this very stimulating event, which it wants you to perpetuate. The second thing the prefrontal cortex does is form a feedback loop. Now, a feedback loop is essentially something that encourages a behavior, as we were saying before. You notice the trends, you get the chemical, and the chemical encourages you to perform the stimulating event. Now, interestingly, this feedback loop works on glutamate, which is a different hormone to dopamine. And this is really important because this means this feedback loop can still be provoked, can still provoke strong signals for you to complete this action, even if the brain is suffering from a desensitization to dopamine, which is a side effect of porn. Everything just becomes grey and unenjoyable because you're so used to these massive dopamine hits from porn. But importantly, that feedback loop works on glutamate, so that can still work even when everything is totally desensitized. So to sum it up, we have the reward circuit, which is formed by dopamine. If that gets passed on to the PFC notices trends and associations through this stimulating event, and it forms a feedback loop based on glutamate in order to reward you and help you complete that stimulating action. So another key component of sensitization is long-term depression. Now, long-term depression is a very complicated thing, and I'll attempt to sum it up pretty simply here. Essentially, if you continue to indulge in an addiction, such as porn, this inhibits the so-called braking system, GABA, of the brain's reward circuitry. And this has the effect of making you super sensitive to porn. And there's a pretty good analogy from this on Your Brain on porn.com. So instead of a normal brain operation, which is more like city driving where you check for oncoming traffic at every intersection, your sensitized porn pathway is like the Autobahn. There are no traffic lights, and porn is the only BMW on the road. So pretty simple stuff here. If you have no inhibitions, or if you have lowered inhibitions, you're not going to be checking yourself to make sure your behavior is acceptable, appropriate, and that sort of thing. You're just going to go about doing stuff. It's like being drunk. Your inhibitions are lowered, you jump on the dance floor, you don't really care about your behavior, and you start doing some crazy dance moves. And it's just like this with porn. You don't have this braking system on the reward circuitry of your brain. The reward circuitry doesn't check itself, and thus it's much easier to just consume porn. So the final point I want to talk about today is DeltaFosB. Now, DeltaFosB is a regulatory protein molecule designed to motivate us towards certain actions. Essentially, you consider it as a signal to binge and to get in whilst the going is good with regards to food and reproduction, which is again two of the strongest evolutionary desires in the entirety of biology. And again, there is a reason why this is in place. It may seem like it is so unnecessary in modern lifestyle, and perhaps you could consider it that, yeah, it might be, but for millions and millions of years, for 99.9% of human history, it's been incredibly, not just human history, but biologically speaking history, because other animals have this chemical too, it is highly advantageous to have this protein. Because let's think about this. For, again, 99.999, repeating for infinity, percent of humanity's evolutionary history, right back when we were a little mammal and proto-mammal and that sort of thing, resources were scarce. There's not the plentiful food that we have nowadays. We can basically eat whatever we want and die of obesity and heart disease and this sort of thing. And obviously sexual reproduction is not something that's consistently available. It's a very rare resource. It doesn't come up very often, so it's incredibly advantageous for an animal to have this binge signal and to get in whilst the going is good, because obviously if you find like a food source that's high in fat, it's high in salt and high in sugar, you want to be extremely sensitive towards that because it might not come up again. So you do want this binge signal, to encourage you to get in there and gorge yourself, because that's advantageous. But again, in the modern world, it might not be so advantageous because we do have, unlimited resources essentially, and with porn we have unlimited access to, quote, sexual reproduction. Again, your brain considers it to be sexual reproduction. So this actually might be a bit of a disadvantage. But again, every animal throughout history, regardless of how far back you go, if they weren't sensitive to binging, if they found a big food source, or they found ample sexual reproduction, but they're like, meh, I'll get around to it later, those animals did not reproduce and they did not pass on their genetics. The animals that were very sensitive, that did have this binge signal and wanted to get in whilst the going was good, those were the animals that managed to pass on their genetics, and that is why things are the way they are nowadays. So DeltaFosB alters gene expression, affecting the makeup of your neural synapses. Now, a neural synapse is essentially a junction between two nerves in your nervous system, and obviously, if affecting the makeup of that, it's going to affect how they talk to one another. Are they going to be sensitive to certain things? Are they going to be desensitive to certain things? And that sort of stuff. So DeltaFosB not only initiates behaviors, but helps to sustain them, as it hangs around for a month or two after you stop needing it, which helps trigger a relapse. Again, you may quit porn for a little bit, but this chemical that encourages you to binge and get in whilst the going is good because this resource is really limited is still hanging around, and that obviously can help you consume porn again. Additionally, the sensitized neural pathways that DeltaFosB triggers linger for an unknown period of time, which further helps to trigger a relapse. So again, it's tough. Like, I'm not going to deny quitting porn might be tough for a lot of people because of these chemical evolutionary things that are in place. Again, you quit porn, but these sensitized neural pathways are still there. They don't just disappear overnight, and you have this chemical which is encouraging you to binge that can help trigger a relapse. So to sum DeltaFosB up, we have continued consumption of the stimulus, which leads to the production of DeltaFosB. This activates certain genes. It changes the makeup of your neural synapses, which causes both sensitization and desensitization. So on a very basic level, that's how the concept of sensitization works. Essentially, your brain will respond to certain behaviors or certain stimulations that it encounters, and it wants you to repeat these behaviors because it thinks they're advantageous. And again, for the majority of human evolutionary history, for animal evolutionary history, it is extremely, extremely advantageous to be very sensitive to sexual reproduction, because animals that weren't sensitive to reproduction, if they were ambivalent about it, or they weren't as keen to get in, they died out and they did not pass on their genetics. The animals that really, really had a strong desire to reproduce, they were the animals that likely ended up reproducing. They were the animal that was most fit for the environment, and obviously they passed down to genetics, and this only gets stronger as the generations go on, and that's why the things are the way they are. Biological reality is humans are still, we share a lot in common with even lobsters and single-celled organisms with regards to sexual reproduction. It's an old, deep evolutionary drive, and it doesn't go away just because we have unlimited resources and a nice civilization to live to, and we walk upright and we have the biggest brains and thumbs and this sort of thing. These things don't go away. Biology evolves very slowly, but culture and technology evolve very rapidly. Unfortunately, culture and technology have not yet managed to have the capacity to completely eliminate deep biological drives, such as the need to consume fatty foods, salty foods, sugary foods, and obviously engage in sexual reproduction. It's a very, very strong urge. The human brain is very sensitized to it, and when you expose yourself to sexual reproduction, your body, your genes, these deep evolutionary drives want you to perpetuate this behavior. It will reward you. It will make you extremely sensitive to this. It will notice every little thing that led up to sexual reproduction and exacerbate them, place great emphasis on them, and reward you for partaking in these behaviors. So again, this can lead to a big problem where the front door shuts and you realize you're alone. You suddenly get super horny. Even though this in itself is not very sexually stimulating, it's an event circumstantial to a very heavily stimulating event that your brain wants you to continue. Your brain wants you to have sex a lot. It wants you to pass on your genes, because animals that didn't care about that sort of thing, they died out. So that's sensitization, a very interesting bit of neurochemistry that helps perpetuate certain actions to the point where it becomes deleterious for your health once we're talking about porn in the modern age. Now, it does sound very doom and gloom. It is a very powerful and addictive behavioral feedback loop, but it is curable. It is fixable. I fixed it in myself. Other people have fixed it within themselves. And as I said at the start of the video, once you know how something works and how it affects you, which I've done today, it becomes that much easier to muster the willpower to make a change, because you begin to understand how things work. Because if you don't understand how things work, you don't know where to start, you don't know where to break the feedback loop, and this sort of thing. And obviously the principal thing to do here is to break the feedback loop. You need to stop watching porn. You don't, do a half-assed thing where it's like, I'll stop watching video porn, but I'll just keep looking up still images or whatever. No, you just need to remove the stimulus from your life because, you know, you want to have a good life. You want to be self-improving. You don't want to be those type of people who take ages to get sexually aroused. You can't get sexually aroused with real women. This is something, and again, this is something that's not often discussed. This is something that can have quite a profound effect on your life, both in your sexual life, because if you can't get it up, that's embarrassing, that's humiliating, it makes you feel terrible, but also in your wider life. If you become extremely sensitized to certain things, but desensitized to others, if you become desensitized to dopamine, you're not going to be able to conduct your life in a way that is beneficial and glorious. You're going to be just a coma. That's all you're going to be, both in the sexual sense and in the rest of your life. You're just going to be someone who demands instant gratification at every turn, which is not the way to conduct yourself to bring about a bountiful life, because you need to be able to defer gratification. And that's the key point that I want to take away here. You need to be able to defer gratification in your life, and one of the key things to do here is to wean yourself off porn. You do need to stop watching porn. It is terrible for your brain. I think I've done an adequate job of explaining at least one part of that today. I really hope you do all quit porn. It's much nicer up here, I can tell you that much. And it does have the opposite effect. You become totally desensitized to porn. It's weird. It's gross. It's like, it's almost funny just how just outlandish it is once you quit porn. So it's certainly doable. I hope you all, I wish you all good luck in your journey towards quitting porn. If you have anything else to add to the conversation, please feel free to leave it down in the comments below. If you're an angry Kuma who just wants to cope, feel free to put that down in the comment section below. I'll just ignore it or laugh at it because I think it's hilarious. Thanks all for sticking around, and have a good one.